Hello guys, in the previous lecture, we created a config file to separate important information like database, secret key for the session, and port number. In this lecture, we are going to add a login feature. It will be divided by two parts. Remember in the past couple of lectures, I talked about cookie and session. Well, in the next lecture, we are going to see it in action on how does cookie and session play along together with login as well as sign up. So just want to go through it again. Cookie parser will parse the cookie header and handle cookie separation and encoding, maybe even decrypt it. So cookie will actually take the session data and encrypt it and pass it to browser. Well, session is to store the data like user ID into a temporary memory store. It could be a default memory store, or it could be another memory store like MongoDB or Redis, where it can be used during a certain period. So without further ado, let's get started. First, we have to install the database for storing the session, alright? The library we will call Connect Mongo. So we're gonna go and install it first. Go to your terminal and type in npm install connect mongo --safe. And while it's waiting, we will require the file first. So we're gonna type in mongo store equals to require connect mongo. All right. So right now we need to update our server setting. So we already required the libraries. So right now we need to pass in the session object to Mongo store so that it knows that the session will be based on the express session library. So let's pass in right now. Pass in session over here. All right. Save it. Mongo store library is depending on express session. Without express session, without this over here, it won't work. All right. So this time, instead of saving it into a temporary memory store, we want to save the session into MongoDB database. We will check MongoLab later on to see that every session will be saved into the database, which is MongoDB. So just want to tell you that Mongo store is specifically to store session on the server side. So next, let's modify our session store, which by default saved by memory, and let's add the store, which is connect mongo. So go down here and you add a comma, and you wanna type in store. So the session will be saved in the MongoDB store, which is connect mongo, and you type in a new instance of Mongo store, and you pass in an object which is URL and as well as auto reconnect. The URL will be, guess what? It will be the same as the database URL that you've been using right now for Mongoose. So type in secret.database. And for auto reconnect, you wanna pass in true. So it will auto reconnecting. So now is the authentication library part. The library that we're going to use is passport.js. So let's go to passport.js website. All right, this is the website. Passport is a library created by a guy named Jared Hansen. This is the guy named Jared Hansen. It's not only for local login, but it provides OAuth login like Facebook, Google, Twitter, and other social networking like Twitter. You can take a look at this: Twitter, Facebook. In this course, I'm only going to cover local login and Facebook login. And I want to tell you that Passport will save us a lot of headache in the login part. So without wasting time, let's go back to our text editor and require Passport library. So we're going to type in here, down below Mongo store, you want to type in var passport equals to require, and you want to require that library, which is Passport. But we haven't installed it yet. So go to your terminal, and since Mongo store already installed, Connect Mongo is already installed, we want to npm install passport and --safe. Wait for a couple of seconds, and for the time being, it already installed. Alright, let's go back to our text editor. Remember in the past video, we created a file called passport.js under the config folder. So let's go to that file. So go to config and go to passport.js. If you want to use Passport library in one of our route, which is login, we have to configure it first. You can think of it as setting up a new rule in a config file so that a login route could use it. Or you can think of it as a middleware. It is a middleware actually. So first, we need to require two libraries to be used, which is Passport and local strategy. So type in Passport equals to require Passport. Next, you want to require the local strategy equals to require Passport dash local and dot strategy. Right, but we haven't installed this yet, so let's go ahead to our terminal again and npm install Passport dash local dash safe, so it'll be saving to package.json. Okay, so if you're having this error, meaning you type it wrong, so check whether, alright, here you are. I forgot to put R here, so save it, wait it for it to be installed, and once installed, go back to your text editor. We are requiring both libraries. Passport is for the authentication part, but how about local strategy? It is simply one of Passport library, which created by Jared Hansen again for the sake of local login. As I said earlier, there are libraries like Facebook login, Twitter, and Google login. We will get back to social login as in Facebook login after we finish this local login first. So there are three sections in this file that we need to create. First, we have to serialize and deserialize user objects. But what the heck is serialize and deserialize? I wonder what is that. We'll explain to you guys soon. Second section is we will write a middleware that will process the login mechanism. This is the most important part, the second one. And lastly, we're going to create a custom function to validate whether a user is logged in or not. So we got to have first section is to serialize and deserialize. Second is a middleware. Lastly is a custom function to check, to validate. Let's move on to our first section. Let me type the code first, then I will explain what it does. Type in serialize user. Add an anonymous function with a parameter of error, actually a parameter of user, and a callback. Right? And then you want to pass in a callback here with a parameter of null and the user ID, which is _ID. By default, in every MongoDB database, it will have this so-called ID. You don't need to create it. If you go back to model and you go back to user.js, we didn't even specify it. But let's say we create a new user. A self-generated ID will be created just for this user. All right. So let's go back to our config under passport.js. And next is type in passport.deserialize user. Add an anonymous function with parameter of error at the ID and a callback, right? Now you want to check whether there's a user or not. So you want to check find by ID. You want to pass in the ID and anonymous function again with parameter of error and the user. And if it's success, you simply want to call it back with an error and as well as the user. All right. So what is serialize? What is this mystical syntax? Serialization is the process of translating data structures or object state into a format that can be stored. Again, we want to translate the data structures or an object which is a user object, and we want to translate it into a format that can be stored. So we're gonna store it, guess where? In a Connect Mongo. We're gonna store it in the MongoDB later on. The key of user object you provide in the second argument, which is this one, in serialize function, will be saved in the session and is used to retrieve the whole object via the serialize function. Serialize function determines what data from the user object should be stored in the session. So in our case, we want to store the ID only. And the result of the serialize user method will be attached to the session as request the user dot underscore ID. It will be looking like this when you save it in the session, right? Which is in turn request a user. So later on, if you want to access a user, we just log in, you just type in request a user. How about deserialize? In deserialize function, you provide in first argument of deserialize function that same key of user object that was given to done function in serialize call. So your whole object is retrieved with the help of the key. So that's why we are find using one of the mongoose method to find by ID. This ID is actually from the serialized user ID. That key here is ID. It could be anything. It can be key of the user like name, email, like for example, it could be name, email, except for password, alright, the one password. In the serialize function, that key is will be matched in a memory or array or database or any data resource. In our case, we are using a temporary database, which is Connect Mongo. Again, the fetch object is attached to request object as request a user. Again, you can access the user will log in as in writing request a user. So that's how we could use request a user. But still, you guys still don't understand, right? In easy term, the serialization method will take place, which, for example, in the real world example, there's a doctor. It will take your data and it will put it into a temporary database. And then later on, if the doctor wants to see your information, he or she could simply fetch it from the temporary database. The simplest terminology that I could think of. I'm going to delete this. So let's move on to the next section, which is the middleware. So let me type in the middleware first, and I'm going to explain what it does. Passport.use local login. Add anonymous function. Actually, you don't need to add anonymous function. You need to add instance of local strategy because we are using local strategy. And then you pass in an object in there. The required fields like username field, which is email, password field, password. And lastly, you want to pass request to callback. And you want to set it as true. And then next, what you want to do is you want to add an anonymous function, which is request, email, password, and the callback. Simply do this. So right now what we need to do is we want to find a specific user in the database. So find one, or you can even use find by ID, but I'm just going to use find one. And then you want to pass in the email, and the email that the user type in, then add another anonymous function, which is with the parameter of error and user. And then once done, you want to kind of like validate, like if there's an error, simply return with a callback of an error. Second, if there's no error, or if it's not the user, let's say the user doesn't exist, you want to return done. You want to return the callback with the parameter null, false, and you want to pass in a flash message. And then you want to pass in login message, no user has been found. Next, if you want to check if the password of the user is wrong, so you simply want to use one of its custom method that we wrote in back in the user.js under models folder. We want to use this compare password methods in the passport configuration. So you pass in password over here, right? And then if the password doesn't match, we simply want to return a callback with null, false, and then the message that you want to attach, which is login message again with oops, wrong password, pal. So if everything is good, if there's no error, if the user does exist, and if the password does match, you want to return the callback with a null and user. I'm gonna clean up a little bit. So this is the middleware that we're going to use for Passport. So I'm going to explain to you guys. All right, first you want to give the middleware a name so that it could be recognized later on in another route. So we're going to give it a local login. You can name it anything you want, so that you can refer it at a login route later on again. And then next, you want to create a new anonymous instance of local strategy object. And then you want to pass it a required fields like username field, password field, and as well as pass requests to callback. All right. So, but what are these three fields? By default, local strategy uses username and password, but we override it with an email. So try passing an email. And second is you add an anonymous function. We're wrong here. Email. So we add an anonymous function here, and then you want to kind of like validate it. You want to pass in the request, email, password, and a callback. So in this anonymous function, you want to find in your database the specific email that you just type in. If it's matched, then simply do this. If there's an error, like some kind of internet error, then return with a callback. If the user is not found, I mean, if it's not exists, then return with this message as well, which is request of flash. Remember when we did it in the sign up field, in the sign up page? And second is you want to compare the password that the user type in and the password that in the database. So that's what we're using, compare password, which is in models user.js, which is this one. It will use this method. So if it's wrong, the password, if it does not match, then simply return with a message, oops, wrong password, pal. And lastly, you want to return the callback with a parameter of null, I mean is good, and the user object. So later on, you can use it like this: request.user.id or request.user.profile.name. All right. So in every request, this object will be stored in a session. Then it can be used in any page that requires you to log in. So next, let's move on to the next section, which is custom function to validate. All right, in the last section, we are going to create a custom function, and let's name it is authenticated. This function is to check whether the user is logged in or not. So let's go ahead and type it. So type in exports dot is authenticated. Then you want to give it a function and request. This is not an anonymous function because you name this function as is authenticated versus this anonymous function. This anonymous function doesn't have a name. So you pass the request, response, and a callback. A callback, you can name it anything, done or next. I just want to differentiate that. Like a login, you want to give it a name like done, or like in routes, you want to give it next, and so on and so forth. So next is if request, there's a built-in method which called is authenticated. If the request is authenticated, if the users log in, then simply go to the next callback, right? Else you want to return the callback. All right, you want to return, meaning it's if the request is authenticated, then simply grant the access to the user to access any route that requires you to authenticate it. And lastly, if it's not authenticated, then you want to redirect the user back to the login page. We haven't created a login page yet. So in the next lecture, we're going to create our login page and we're going to test it out. So I'll see you guys next lecture. Bye.